Are you a racist?
In the white mind, Black people are the ultimate racial other.
Every person, every idea, and every policy is either racist or anti-racist.
Those messages are being taught in colleges, high schools, grade schools these days. It's good to educate people about racism. But the author of Woke Racism, John McWhorter, says this new approach to race is like a new religion that's betraying America. Last year, I released 2 short videos with McWhorter, but a complex topic like race deserves more time. So here's our full interview about the new religion. A new religion has betrayed America?
Well, it really has. There is something afoot that's often called the woke mob, but it's not just a mob, and it's not just about having a certain brand of political awareness. There is a new way of thinking that incorporates the aspect of religion that requires that you sequester a part of your brain for illogical processing. There's a suspension of disbelief that's necessary. And that is the way we're being encouraged to think about power relations, and especially race these days. It's a religion where instead of the Christian idea that your main goal is to demonstrate your faith and that supersedes all other concerns, the main goal in this religion is to demonstrate that you are not a racist person. And you're supposed to demonstrate that you're not a racist person, even if you are not helping and perhaps even harming Black people. And when you call these kinds of people on this, they just kind of look at you, because they really are part of what an anthropologist would recognize as a religious faith that tells you to put one thing over everything else, regardless of logic or even morality. So I really do see all of us as having watched a new religion coalesce and especially become entrenched among a significant number of people, and not just the intelligentsia, since roughly last summer. I've been amazed. I have lived during a time when I could watch a religion form. It's neat.
We ask for forgiveness from our Black brothers and sisters.
But this is a clearly fact-based belief. There is racism.
Oh, there certainly is. Racism certainly exists. The question is, 1, how much? Another question is, 2, what effect does it have? And 3, what do you do to eliminate the racism, or at least its effects? And the way we're being encouraged to think about these things has very little to do with any of those 3 questions. Just to take a simple example, if standardized tests are something that Black kids tend not to be as good at as white kids, the new way of looking at things is that the tests are racist, and you're not supposed to probe too closely as to how that could be, or rather you're to think that the tests are racist simply because Black kids don't do as well on them. That is racism. And therefore you're supposed to eliminate the test and de-emphasize the objective and analytical kind of thinking that the tests require.
These tests, which are denying access.
Maybe the test is racist.
The thing is, it's not. And so, for example, it used to be 40 years ago that you could say that the tests were biased. Some of them were. That's been eliminated since roughly the Carter administration. Beyond that, a way of looking at this that any civil rights leader until about 10 minutes ago would have understood is that you think, well, how can we make it so that Black kids are better at the test? Today's idea is eliminate the test because it is a racist, it is a bigot, it is somehow unreasonable to expect Black kids to use analytical thinking in a rigorous way. And of course, this is something that Strom Thurmond would have been very happy to hear. And the idea is that you take away the tests in order to show that you are not a racist because the tests have a way of making Black people unhappy. That's something that, Bayard Rustin, Martin Luther King, Whitney Young, people like that wouldn't have understood this. This is a new way of thinking. It's a religious way of thinking.
Why else would there be this disparity if not racism?
See, that's the thing, because we're being dared to say that the tests are difficult for Black kids because of some congenital defect. The idea is that if it isn't that Black kids are dumb, then it must be that the tests are unjust in some way. But that's profoundly unimaginative. It might be that it's neither that the kids are dumb, nor that there's something wrong with the tests, but that Black kids are inadequately prepared to exert the particular kind of mental muscle that those tests require, and that we solve that problem and look into the past to see what conditions have enabled Black kids to do well on tests, such as you can go 100 years ago. Lynching is regular. Black kids in Washington, D.C. at Dunbar High School were outperforming white kids on that era's version of standardized tests. That was considered, quite ordinary, but we're trained not to even think about things like that today. And so, are the tests racist if they're asking what wine goes with chicken? Yeah. But that's not what these tests ask these days. The issue is, one, making sure that Black kids are prepared for the tests. And two, to the extent that the Black community is often unaware of the availability of free coaching for those tests, which is the case in many cities, we need to get the word out. There used to be something called getting the word out. Now, instead, we battle racism. They aren't always the same thing.
Black kids often go to lousy schools.
They sure do. And so the issue is to make sure that Black kids go to less lousy schools, and notice that white kids who go to lousy schools don't test well either. Our problem is that, unfortunately, middle-class Black kids often don't test well either. And the reason for these things is because of aspects of Black culture that don't stress getting good at those tests in the way that aspects of, say, South Asian immigrant culture clearly does. So the idea is that there are things, some things that within the Black community, as it's called, they might be worked on. But unfortunately, we have an intelligentsia that is dead set against any idea that Black culture might have some things that need to be trimmed or repaired. The idea seems to be that all of the world's peoples have problems of some kind, that cultures have good sides and bad sides. There's one exception, and that is descendants of African slaves in the United States, starting especially at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. Our culture has no possible flaws. Our culture is simply a response to white perfidy. White perfidy is responsible for anything that's wrong in the Black community. The problem with that is that it's based on a version of social history that operates on roughly the level of an intelligent 8-year-old. We're being taught something that is never said explicitly, which is that when it comes to Black people and Black Americans only, sociology is ABC. There's nothing complicated. Social history suddenly becomes as easy as 1, 2, 3. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Everything that bedevils the Black community is not due to white perfidy of any kind, be it, concrete or abstract. Stuff gets complicated over 400 years, and our intelligentsia either doesn't want to admit it or is afraid that if they say the emperor has no clothes, they're going to get called a racist on Twitter. Most people don't want to be called a racist on Twitter. And so we have a culture of race discussion that's based on mendacity and fear rather than honesty and pragmatism.
If it's about systemic racism, then I'm puzzled why very Black people from Africa and the Caribbean do well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the response to that is you can't compare native-born Black Americans to immigrants, because immigrants are people who had a certain degree of pluck, as it's often put, a certain degree of determination. But the thing is, let's say that's true. Nevertheless, it's the case that those people come here and deal with the same racism that everybody else does, and yet they make the best of the worst, which simply means that so could Black Americans. It means that the racism, whether it is overt or abstract, is not as decisive as we're being told. So let's say that all the Nigerians coming over are people who were looking across the ocean and thinking, I shall seek my main chance in New York City and I'm going to try my very best. And that's different from somebody who is just born here and is one of the crowd. Let's say that that's true. I don't dispute it. But nevertheless, they get here. They're brown-skinned. They're often poorer than most Black Americans at first, not Nigerians specifically, but many dark-skinned immigrants. And yet they do what needs to be done, which means that Black Americans could as well, that we need to just change our orientation and stop thinking of white racism and systemic racism as the conclusive obstacles that we pretend that they are.
And you are vilified for saying that.
You know what, John? Not as much as I used to be. You and I go back. And talk about 202, 2002, 2003. Oh, yeah, I was public enemy number one. But I think we've gotten to a point that a critical mass of people, especially Black people who were kids then, who are now becoming adults, understand that racism exists, but that a general mantra that for only Black Americans, racism is such a conclusive obstacle that our main job must be to decry the racism rather than talking about what to do to get around it. There is beginning to be a certain fraying, which is part of why I have been so dedicated over about the past year in fighting this racial reckoning fashion that teaches Black America that yes, we can't is the slogan that we need to embrace. Because really, it's at the point where, especially with social media, I think social media can help unite a common consensus that this professional, charismatic fatalism doesn't make anybody less poor. It doesn't make anybody more happy. But we've got to get rid of a certain kind of especially white, middle-class, enlightened American who knuckles under to the illogic of books like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility or Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, out of a sense that if they don't, they're bad people or they don't want to get called racist on Twitter. It won't do, because all of this pushes the day ahead that Black people will be able to show what we're made of.
Kendi calls all race disparities systemic racism.
White Americans have more because of racism.
Kendi is dim. Frankly, that idea is quite charismatic. It is something that gives a certain kind of pleasure because it makes it seem like you've got one answer to a bunch of things that look disparate and difficult. But it has nothing to do with what social history actually works like. All disparities between white people and Black people are not due to something unfair that was driven by whites. Things are much more complex than that. What his kind of reasoning is doing is leaving Black people in the lurch. There is a disproportionate number of suspensions of Black boys in schools for violence. Now, the Kendian position is to say that that must be racist because Black boys aren't the only ones. That disproportion must be because of a stereotype of Black men as violent. But the truth is that the data makes it very clear that Black boys do commit more violent acts in the schools. If you've got a violent Black kid in a school like that and you don't take that kid out, the violence is being perpetrated against other Black kids, not some white kid who somebody like Kendi might deep down think deserves to be tortured because Black people used to be slaves and redlining was a bad thing. So a lot of what he's talking about leaves Black kids and Black people in the lurch, all in the name of this simplistic idea that if there's a white-Black disparity, it must be because of something called racism, which must be something called eliminated. If Kendi wins, we all lose. And I know that it seemed probably a little small of me to call Kendi dim, but frankly, he is. And more to the point, I didn't start saying so until he started attacking me in public as a racist. If he's going to call me a racist and he's going to do it more than once, then I'm going to call him for what he is, which is that he's unreflective. And it dismays me to see the country listening to such obviously useless, underthought counsel.
I diagnose America as racist when I say that even America has stage 4 metastatic racism.
And pretending that it's wisdom because he wears dreadlocks and a suit at the same time, and they're afraid of being called a racist on Twitter. Our real way of overcoming is going to be to think.
You can call him dim, but he's winning the hearts and minds.
You know something? On even days, I think that that's true. And I figure that my job as an honest person is just to be the person who speaks truth as much as possible. On odd days, I think that part of the reason we feel like he's winning is because we've had a very strange year-long period since last summer where, and I think this is what historians are going to note that we're only beginning to see, all of life was taking place on Zoom for a while. And so we have to remember that a lot of these defenestrations based on something called anti-racism that was really just sandbox one-upmanship. All this stuff took place on Zoom with people having toxic little conversations in the chat section, et cetera. All these things that happen weren't based on meetings taking place in rooms where people are breathing the same air. I think that as we come out of the pandemic and we're less bored, less anxious, and back to communicating in rooms where we're breathing each other's air, I suspect that a lot of the extremes that we saw are going to start retreating because there's going to be a pushback. And we can watch this in a year and laugh at me if I turn out to be wrong, but I sense the pendulum shifting. I don't know if the Kendi position is winning. I know that right now he's very fashionable, but the question has to be, is what he's saying having any effect, for one thing? So you can't ask that 10 minutes later, but after at least a couple of years, the question is going to be all these companies that have been listening to him, all the people with his advice, what progress has there been? And then also, people's general assessment has a way of corresponding with the quality of what they put out there. And it takes some time. I'm not sure if he's winning. If he does, it really is a national tragedy, and I will own it in 5 years if that's the way it turns out to be. I suspect that it's going to be that he's going to start being treated as one voice of many, and because that voice, reducing everything to racism because it makes for good copy. And I shouldn't say that. He's not being a huckster. He doesn't know any better. He's sincere. But that idea that all of these disparities are based on racism is something that a third-rate kind of thinker, often who preaches on street corners, has about how American sociology works. Everybody has always known that type. It comes from a certain segment of society. It comes from people who think they're educated but aren't really. And it sounds good. It's fun to listen to people like that. There's somebody like that at almost every Black barbecue, and that person is probably the hit of the afternoon and the evening. The idea that the country needs to take its cue from reasoning that simplistic, I hope that America can do better than that. If it can't, well, life is hard, and I've always known that, but we'll see.
It's happening at the white barbecue now, too.
I know. And sometimes I'm at the white barbecue and I'm noticing it. But the truth is that the person who is making that case can rarely make a sustained argument. And often the person who's making that case, if you look deeply into their eyes, you can see that what they really are is a parishioner. They're pretending to believe these things because they don't want to get called a racist on Twitter. And they feel like the measure of their being a good person is to be anti-racist. I get it. I can imagine being that person. But that person is increasingly, in my view, at the white barbecues that I go to, that kind of person is not as common even as they were 6 months ago. So we'll see what happens with the barbecued meat. But I sense, maybe, talk about faith. Do I have faith in my fellow Americans? I assume that simplistic BS can only rule the roost for so long. But as I say that, I realize, what country do I think I'm in to have that much faith that there's going to be change? We'll see. I'm beginning to see, when I stick my finger up into the wind, I'm beginning to sense that the tide is turning.
You're a linguist. Part of what this movement has done is change language. How does that play into this? Equality changing to equity.
We're in a situation where it can be really hard for us to talk to each other because we don't know what the words we're using mean. So systemic racism. And you think to yourself, well, how is a system a bigot? And then you learn that the idea is that where there are white and Black disparities, we're supposed to call that phenomenon racism in the same way as Archie Bunker was racist.
The country is going straight into the dumper.
That's kind of complicated, and it never fully holds together to anybody who really keeps thinking about it. It's fragile, so to speak. And that's a hard one. Equity versus equality. Equity is something that you have to force from a society that supposedly doesn't want it. So equity is that white people and Black people are the same, and you made it that way because that's the way it should be, as opposed to equality of ability, equality of quality, etc. These things are tough. What cancel culture? What does that mean? That has become as obscure a term at this point. You can use it to mean so many different things. As dating, what does it mean? Oh, they dated. That could mean either that they had a chocolate malted one afternoon or that they had an open sexual relationship for 7 years. Dating means all of those things. What is cancel culture? Equally squishy. And some of this is just the way language is, but a lot of it is because we've got the internet. We've got a year where everybody spent a whole year on nothing but the internet because you couldn't go outside. And 3, these issues elicit a great deal of passion. So next thing you know, you have a kind of a lexicographer's mess, especially over about the past year.
It seems odd to me that this is happening now when I would think there is less racism in America than there ever was before. There's more intermarriage. There's more opportunity for minorities. Why now?
Because this is the sort of thing that one hates to say. It's easy to exaggerate about the degree of your victimhood when actually it has retreated significantly. So there was nobody in 1950 who walked around exaggerating. And it wasn't that that wouldn't have been possible. Racism was much more overt, but it was never that a Black person walked around with racism being all of what life was. If anything, you didn't allow that in 1950 because there was a coping strategy that was necessary. And so you didn't exaggerate, life just offered a certain something. To fashion a victimization identity that you can only justify with abstractions and shrugs of the shoulders is a luxury available to people who aren't really suffering that much. It's a tic. It's a complex. Psychologists recognize it. It's the victimization mindset. And it can only happen after 1966, that you start having that nagging feeling that people are exaggerating. There were people who said that people exaggerated, Black people exaggerated before 1966. And I think it's pretty easy for us all to agree, 99 out of 100 of us will agree, that any white person in 1954 who said that Black people were exaggerating about racism was just naive. That's a product of their times. After the late 60s, white people, I think, started sitting on the side and saying, aren't they exaggerating? I hate to say it. And here we are 50 years later, and those white people's children are saying again, is it really that bad compared to the way it was, say, 40 years ago? And the answer is obviously not, but one is to pretend, because the Black version of this religion is that your identity is that of victim. The most interesting thing about you is that you suffer at the hands of white dismissal. Your very identity is that which whites don't really see. That can be a very comforting feeling, especially if shared with a group, that shared sense of victimhood, a whole group-wide victimhood complex that feels good. It's a cloak. It gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of innocence. It's perfectly natural. Human beings of all kinds do it. But it is an ailment that Black America suffers from a surfeit of. And that's where we are. Yeah, racism exists, certainly. But the question is it an obstacle or an inconvenience? And if it's an inconvenience, and especially one that's as abstract as it is for the vast majority of Black people today, you can't help noticing a certain disparity between the way we talk about it and the reality. And for a white person to wonder about that does not make them a racist. It makes them somebody who's experiencing reality with their brains as they were given by whoever it is up there who gives out brains. But we're taught that for you, John, to say that makes you a bigot.
In America today, there are advantages to being a victim.
Yes. If you are exaggerating your victimhood, there is a critical mass of non-Black people who are ready to listen to you, to hear you out, and not only to give you things on the basis. I don't think that most people who strike that note are seeking resources. I've never met that person. If they're people like that, they're damn good actors. But it gives you an emotional balm to be treated as this victimized person. Who doesn't, on a certain level, like a pat on the head and a quick hug? All of us, to an extent. Black America is encouraged to OD on that. And it's what creates this false sort of minuet that we all do.
In your current book, you talk about how students were so upset by what Jason Kilborn did.
Jason Kilborn was a law professor. He was at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he was giving a test on employment discrimination. And part of employment discrimination involves people calling each other things. And so he was giving a case where the N word was used, and he spelled it N and then 5 asterisks. So the idea is to not give offense, but to indicate the existence of, because of the usage of, the word. A group of Black students in the class decided that they had been injured by seeing that on paper. One of them claimed that they had heart palpitations. Frankly, no, they're lying. They're exaggerating. The reason they're doing it is not because they're bad people. They're doing it because claiming that kind of victimhood gives them a sense of significance, a sense of belonging, a sense of togetherness, and also a sense that they're contributing to a struggle that their ancestors dealt with in such a more concrete way. You want to be part of the story, so you create something like that. But if any of those students were genuinely hurt by seeing N asterisk, 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 asterisk. You ever tried to say asterisk more than once? If you see that on the page and you have heart palpitations, you need therapy. And it doesn't make it different that you're a Black person in 2021. If that upsets you that much, you need help. You need counseling. And yet, if you would have said that to any of those students, they would have, rented a howitzer and blown your house up.
From the Student Coalition, I had to seek counsel immediately after the exam to calm myself from what I just experienced.
And I hope that person is still in counseling, because if they're that fragile, they're going to have trouble dealing with this thing called life. They're exaggerating.
And Kilborn had done this on tests for years before.
Mm-hmm. It was during the racial reckoning that a certain number of people decided that this sort of thing would be appropriate. And remember this, we imagine that test taking is taking place in a room with people hunched over papers. That test was on Zoom, and the students who decided that they were offended talked about it in the chat session. This is the sort of thing that would happen much more easily in a situation like that than in real life. But it's no accident that that happened in 2021. We've had a very fertile ground for that kind of creative exaggeration. And I think that it's a pendulum shift.
The word violence is being redefined.
A transgender woman of color walking down the street and being called a man is an act of violence.
That particular situation, I can imagine being processed as violence. It's practically a slur to that person. It would be like somebody who who is very heavy and somebody yells something out at them on the street. I can see how that would hurt. And there's an argument for saying that it's not always just words, but violence is being extended to situations that are much, much less amenable to this analysis. And so just recently, for example, a certain organization, a nonviolence organization at Brandeis University, has given out a list of things that they suggest, quote unquote, that you don't say. The idea being that to use these words is a form of violence, that we're going to extend that term. And you have things like, and this is typical, this is not a cherry-picked example just for effect. Most of them are like this: walk-in. So you're not supposed to talk about walk-in service because not all people can walk. And so it's ableist. And so it's violent to talk about walk-in service. No, it's not. And I can't speak for people who aren't capable of walking, but I deeply doubt that any but maybe one or two of them in this country are hurt to hear about walk-in service. They hear about walk-in service and they wheel themselves in, and they've never thought anything different. But we're thinking of that as violence. It's not that these people are sitting and thinking, how can I get attention? I'm going to use words in manipulative ways to make people jump. I think that there's a certain kind of person who really does cherish the idea of themselves as subjected to endless violence because they feel that that makes them interesting to be a victim. Next thing you know, though, you have a use of a word that simply doesn't make sense in terms of degree. And I think that we need to start calling people on it.
Dictionary.com recently announced it's going to eliminate the word slave. They're going to use enslaved persons instead.
I try to go with the times as much as possible. And on enslaved person, I see where they're coming from. It's not something I would have chosen, but you do hear people process the word slave in ways that imply that they think that some people are slaves inherently. I've even heard Black people outside of America who seem to think of slave in that way. I've seen it with kids. Oh, that wasn't a human being, that was a slave, is what they seem to be thinking. I can get behind enslaved person, the idea being that this was a person who was suffering from a particularly grievous and unpardonable condition. I can't go from enslaved person, however, to using that kind of analysis for just about every adjective that there's a little bit of controversy about. And so victim and survivor are now supposed to be person who was impacted by, person who was affected by. No. And so, for example, right now there are people in Miami, that tower fell. There are many victims. I don't want to talk about them as people who experienced something. They're victims. And sometimes you get weird inconsistencies, like on the Brandeis list. Enslaved person, okay. There's also homeless person, i.e. a person who doesn't have a home. Well, that's no good. That has to be changed because people discriminate against the homeless. And so now you have to have something along the lines of person without a home or something like that. That's inconsistent. It's somebody who has a hammer and finds everything to be a nail. There's room for pruning. I get it. I get calling Gwyneth Paltrow an actor instead of calling her an actress. I get it. I get calling somebody a chairperson. Sure. But do you take it so far as to make it so that almost anything even a reasonable person says can be deemed violent? No, there's no point, because there's real political activism that people should be putting that energy into.
One more example of this congressional hearing where everybody is calling what I would call women birthing people.
Protect Black birthing people.
The problem with birthing people is that, for one thing, you're hitting at one of the core lexical items of any human language. So the idea is we're not going to say mother, we're going to say birthing people. That is something that will fit in with the ideals of so very few people worldwide, regardless of what kind of society it is, that it's obvious that somebody was looking for something to be offended about rather than being genuinely concerned with the state of the world. Because the question just becomes, why wasn't anybody calling for us to call them birthing people 30 years ago, or even 20, or even 10? What were we missing 10 years ago and using mother instead? And the answer is obviously nothing. That's not progress. That's a detour by people who enjoy making other people uncomfortable because they think of that as a form of political activism. But the idea that making people uncomfortable is activism is rather brand new, and I don't think it's going to stand the test of time.
How does your new book tie into this?
It's called Woke Racism, and what it is 6 tart chapters that are making the claim that a new religion has arisen, and more to the point, that it's a shitty religion.
The heartbeat of anti-racism is confession.
The point of it is to say that the way we're being encouraged to think hurts Black people, period. That's what's wrong with it. The fact that it's a religion, maybe some people like religion. The problem is that it's a harmful religion, despite the fact that it's subscribed to by an awful lot of Black people who think of it as a continuation of the civil rights movement. It's a book written mostly to white woke people, frankly, because it's white woke people who have their hands on the levers of power. It's a book that Black woke people won't like either. But my point is that embracing these new ideas and calling it anti-racism hurts the people who you are claiming to be fellow travelers with. And we'll see if the case has any influence.
Are you optimistic at all?
I am guardedly optimistic that sensible people can understand that having a fealty to showing that you are not a racist is different from actually helping people. I humbly think that the people in question need to hear that message from Black people. They can't hear it from white people because the white people can be accused of being racist and will be by the usual suspects. But there is a growing number of Black voices who argue, and frankly, not from the Republican right, but people who are either centrists or liberal Democrats, that this new way of thinking hurts us. So it's not just me, but it's also Coleman Hughes, it's also Chloe Valdery, it's also Thomas Chatterton Williams, it's Camille Foster, Glenn Lowry and I spar about these sorts of things, even though he would identify as more conservative than I would. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to say that it's un-Black to not agree with these ideas. We need it to be clear that there's a diversity of voices. And the idea is to make this hard leftist agitprop one of many voices at the table. I don't think that the hard left needs to be chased into outer space, but it can't be the dominant voice the way it is lately, especially if the way that it dominates is just by making people afraid, because what they do is they call you racist on Twitter. I think that enlightened America needs to develop a backbone and start getting used to being called racist on Twitter and just withstanding it and keeping their voices out there and making us understand what true justice is. But it will require that backbone. Can white America, white intelligentsia America in particular, develop that backbone? I have faith. That's about as much optimism as I can muster. I have faith that it can happen.